Guess what? One day you're gonna die, and there ain't nothing you can do about it. But you know, there's still hope anyway. I have very logical reasons for believing in things that logic and reason can never teach me. It's kind of ironic, but the more complexity science finds in life, the less likely becomes the whole scenario and theory they use to explain its origin. The really amazing thing is that quantum physics shows that nature, at its most fundamental level, strains human credulity and knowledge in ways biblical faith never does. Hi, Cliff Goldstein here. Welcome to the program. You know, in the mid-1950s, my dad built our first home, 23 Hammond Street, Monticello, New York. Monticello's in the Catskill Mountains, what they call upstate New York. I always wondered why they called it upstate. Then I realized that it was upstate north of Manhattan, New York City. Pretty much all of New York is, except for Long Island, which is to the east. Now, the area I grew up in, it was called the Bagel Belt or the Borscht Belt, kind of a northern parallel to the Bible Belt down south. Now, at the time, one time there, that had been a thriving area upstate New York, just big hotels and clubs, and many entertainers worked in that area, and it was a stepping stone to get them to the big time, Manhattan. And as a kid, I have vague memories of a place called Grossinger's and some of these other big hotels there. And there's been a severe economic depression, and the place has been in the doldrums for decades now. And today, there are a lot of Orthodox Jews are up there. They own camps, they own property. I mean, the place is so Jewish now, you can drive along and you'll see signs on the street in Yiddish, This is in New York. Well, anyway, as I said, my dad built our home, 23 Hammond Street, Monticello, New York. And a while back, I drove by and I looked in the backyard, and I saw a same weeping willow tree that I used to play in when I was a kid. Anyway, 2 doors north of 2 doors north of there was 19 Hammond Street, lived my best friend, Harold Supon. 2 doors down the other way lived another best friend of mine, Erwin Steyer. Harold and Erwin were 2 of my best friends from childhood. Some of my earliest memories are of Harold and Erwin, even before. In fact, my parents told me I came home one day in my diapers, and I had gone into my diapers. And my parents said, "Did you make in your diapers?" And I said, "I didn't do it, Harold did it." At least that's what they told me. I said, I don't remember. Anyway, I lived there till the mid-1960s, when due to, too young to understand, but there was an unfortunate infidelity in my immediate family. And right in the middle of my 4th year in elementary school, 4th grade, my family upped and moved from Monticello, New York to Miami Beach. And so the bottom line was the Goldsteins of 1923 Hammond Street were in Monticello, New York, now became the Goldsteins of 9133 Froude Avenue, Surfside, Florida. The bottom line, anyway, we moved away, and I never saw Erwin, my 2 friends, Erwin or Harold, again. Well, as I said, I grew up Miami Beach, and went to Bay Harbor Elementary School, Nautilus Junior High School, and then Miami Beach Senior High School. And in Miami Beach Senior High, my best friend was George Daniel Zifferblatt. I can't even begin to tell all the things we did: skin diving, scuba diving, boating, water skiing, lobster poaching. We love to get out in the ocean and just pound the waves with our boats. My big dream as a kid was I was going to be an ocean racer. Anyway, at the same time I was friends with George. I was in high school and I was flunking chemistry. And I was cheating, and I'm still flunking. So I decide I'm wasting my time, so I skip class and I hang out in the library. And I end up meeting another boy named Jimmy Kronsnoble. And he was a new student, came from Milwaukee and moved there. I don't know why he moved. We became friends. And then he moved back to Milwaukee, and we kept in touch, and we got this idea we were going to go to Europe together after we graduated high school. And we did. We met in Europe, and we traveled around for a while, and I never basically saw him again. We got back to the States. We wrote a few letters back and forth, and that was it. Anyway, these were my four friends from childhood: Harold Suppan, Erwin Steyer, Jimmy Kronsnoble, and George Zifferblatt. Harold, Erwin, Jimmy, and George. And all of them are dead. Harold, I found out a year after it happened, had been killed learning how to fly a small plane. He was 16 years old. Googling his name, I recently found a digital version of the original newspaper article back in 1972 that told about how he and his instructor had been killed. I didn't know the details, just crashed, he died, he was 16 years old. I remember it blew my mind when I found out about it. I found out about it a year or two after it happened. I remember I had written his parents a letter telling them how sorry I was about the death of Harold, and it just kind of freaked me out, his death. Anyway, why I was somehow Googling and looking up recently Harold, I came across a thing from Monticello High School in memoriam, and it had the class of 1973. And that would have been the class I would have graduated from were it not for the infidelity in my family. You know, it's weird to think of the twists of life and how I could have ended up graduating from Monticello Senior High instead of Miami Beach Senior High. But anyway, it had in one of those in memoriam pages, in memoriam pages, and on it, right there next to Harold Suppan, right above it was the name Erwin Steyer. Erwin had died too. He had died at 32 years old. Now, I don't know how he died for sure. I do know that one day when I had visited Monticello, I had asked about Erwin, and someone said, well, he had been struggling with drugs. That's all they said. I don't know, but I'm going to assume it was an overdose. Anyway, over the years go by. Anyway, I moved away from Miami Beach, and I had lost touch with my friend George Zifferblatt. Just lost touch. That was, the way he went one direction, I went in the other direction. Every now and then I'd call his house and I'd get his mother or something. Oh, no, I didn't. I would just forgot about him. But then one day I'm driving down the street and I see a truck, a plumbing truck here in Maryland, and it has a phone number on it. And I said, I know that phone number. And I just knew it was just from my past. So I put the Miami Beach area code in and I dial the number and I get George's mother. Hadn't talked to him in years. And then afterwards I started calling back and forth. And she said George had been sick, very bad colitis, had him in and out of the hospital for months. And at that point I got in touch with George. We stayed in touch. and he was eventually able to beat the colitis, and he seemed to be going along quite well. Then one day, George calls me up and tells me he was sick. He had breast cancer. Then, in 1999, 42 years old, George Zifferblatt died of breast cancer. And even though they had the main memorial service for him in Atlanta, they buried him in the Zifferblatt family plot up in Philadelphia, and I drove up there for the burial service. Anyway, that was that. George dead. Then there was Jimmy Kronsnoble. As I said, the last time I saw him was when we were together in Europe and we had split up. Few letters back and forth, and that was it. I lost touch with him. But, I'd Google his name every now and then, but wouldn't come up with anything. And that was a little weird, because, if you're breathing practically, sooner or later, you're going to find somebody on the internet. You type a name and you get 6.5 million, 0.43 hits and whatever in 2.3 seconds. And I remember Jimmy had talked about wanting to be an architect or something, and I just couldn't understand why I could never find anything for him. Well, every now and then I'd have nothing to do. I'd Google his name, and then one day I got a hit for his name, for Jimmy Kronsnoble. His name was on an AIDS blanket. An AIDS blanket. Well, over time, I kept digging. I felt like a detective. I'd have a clue here and a clue there, and I ended up getting in touch with an uncle who had lived in Florida, and I got a phone number. I was like a detective, and I eventually, though, got on the phone with his mother, and she remembered me as his traveling companion in Europe. And she told me, she said Jimmy had been gay. I never had a clue, nothing. And that she said he died of AIDS at 35 years old. That was 1991. That was the same year my second child was born. In other words, I was just starting my family when Jimmy, my friend from high school, was dying and finally died of AIDS. Harold, Erwin, Jimmy, and George. Harold, dead at 16. Erwin, dead at 32. Jimmy, dead at 35. And George, dead at 42. It's still very, very weird to me. Now, I don't want to say I'm not haunted by these deaths. That would be too strong of a verb. But I'd say for sure I'm troubled. I'm troubled by them instead. I'm 61 years old. I'm still humming along with life. I'm getting kind of old, kind of evaporating. They got all the makeup on me to cover the wrinkles, which I often said wrinkles are the graffiti of time. But I'm aging. I'm slowing down. I can see it. I can feel it. I can see it especially when I look in the mirror. But I'm still very much alive, alive as I've ever been. But Harold, Erwin, Jimmy, and George have been decomposing for years. Poor Harold's been in the ground since 1972. That's 45 years from here. 45 years. Harold's been in the ground almost half a century. Okay, I understand that God has a purpose for me. God has a calling for me in my life, and I understand that, and that's fine. And I don't want to put that down. I'm very grateful for that, believe me. And yes, maybe that still explains why I'm still metabolizing protein, but it doesn't explain why Harold, Erwin, Jimmy, and George aren't. You know, we live in the kind of godless, we live in what we're told is a godless cosmos in which, you know, we're just, everything we're told is just purely materialistic. You know, the scientific industrial complex exists that we're just purely, we live in a purely materialistic universe with nothing supernatural, nothing purposeful. I mean, we just exist by chance with no transcendent, no cosmic purpose to it. If that's true, then, you know, really, there's nothing to understand about these deaths. What do you try to understand? People just die. It's as much a part of the natural world as lightning, as the wind, as the clouds in the sky. Life, death are just different mixes of the same materialistic brew. In and of themselves, in this worldview, life and death mean nothing. What does the difference? We might try to assign meaning to life, but in this worldview, you know what it is? When we try to assign meaning to life, you know what we're doing? It's only one kind of matter, simply seeking to understand itself in relationship to another kind of matter. And even that understanding really is just another configuration of matter. All it is, it's just a certain configurations of the neurons and the chemicals in your brain. That's all the understanding is. And in the end, in that worldview, it means squat, zilch, nada, nothing. Now, the problem is I don't buy into that worldview. I don't buy into that worldview. I don't see it that way. If I did, then however painful these deaths were, there'd be really no mystery to them. They just died, period. And it's of no more real significance than the death of an oyster. In fact, you know, it's funny, David Hume was a philosopher, lived a couple hundred years ago. He said something to the effect of that in the universe, a human life is of no more significance than that of an oyster. So if our lives are no more significant than that of an oyster, then what about our deaths? No more significant as well. But you know, I don't believe that. And I bet most of you listening here too, if you're listening, you don't believe that either. That just doesn't fit. It doesn't compute. It doesn't jive with what's out there, with what we sense, with what we feel in our own lives. You see, I believe in God. I believe in a God of love. I believe in a God who ultimately controls the world. And that's fine. But you know, in one sense, that makes these deaths a little harder to understand, a little harder to fathom. You know what I'm saying? I mean, if there was no God, if there was no purpose to life, as I said, we just live and we just die and that's it. Certain time and there's no rhyme or reason to it. Why these people should have died so young, poof, what does it matter? In a meaningless, godless world, it's a moot point. No more logical than asking, you know, why are there clouds in the sky today and tomorrow it's sunny? But if you believe in God, if you believe in a God of love, then deaths like these, you know, are hard to make sense of. I'll admit it. I mean, sure, life itself is filled with mysteries. So, you know, how much more then is death going to be filled with mysteries as well? But you know, if we go back to God's original purpose for us, if you take the biblical perspective, if we go back to God's original purpose for us, and you know what? Death is the most unnatural of acts. You know, often people say they'll say, death is just a part of life. No, 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 that's a lie. Death is not a part of life. Death is the negation of life. Death is the opposite of life. Death is the enemy of life. And come on, deep down, even if you're an atheist, even if you don't believe anything means anything, you know that that's right. You know there's something terribly, terribly wrong with death. You know it's just not supposed to be here. You know, in a sense, that death is an enemy. I don't know how about you folks, but man, I'm a political animal and I like politics, but boy, was I glad that the 2016 election was over. Oh, I'm sure most of us. And it's crazy. I've been through a lot of political elections, and I've never seen anything like this one. But as crazy as it was, there was probably something about the election that most people didn't know about. Is that, you know, we had the main presidential contenders, and then you had really dozens of other people running for president. Most of them you never hear about because most of them are pretty flaky. But during the election, there was a guy named Zoltan Istvan. And Zoltan Istvan was running for president. And, you know, he was running on what he called the Transhumanist Party. Transhumanism. Trans as above and beyond. And his platform was basically, he's going to say, we're going to use science, we're going to use technology to overcome death. In other words, vote for me for president, and I'm going to pour all sorts of government money into finding ways to beat death. And to make his point, I mean, you can't make this stuff up. To make this point, he drove around the country in a bus called the Immortality Bus. And he wanted, and the bus was shaped like a giant coffin. And the whole point of that was he wanted to drive around in this bus shaped like a coffin to get people to think about death and the inevitability of death. And he said, let me read you, he said, I'm hoping that my immortality bus will become an important symbol in the growing longevity movement around the world. It will be my way of challenging the public's apathetic stance on whether dying is good or not. By engaging people with a provocative, drivable giant coffin, debate is sure to occur across the United States and around the world. And then he goes on, should we use technology to overcome death and become a far stronger species? Science and technology to overcome death. Good luck, Zoltan. You're going to need a lot more luck than you think for that. Now, again, you know, you think about this. In one sense, I understand. But come on, overcoming death by, you know, through science? I mean, what, we've done a pretty good job in extending life. Going from what, an average, I don't know, of 30 to 40 to 70 to 80 or something like that. That's great, that's fine. Though it's got its flip side too, but that's a long way from immortality. Now, as wacko as it is, as wacko as all that is, I think he has a point. I think he has a point. Death is real. Death is in our face. We hate it, and we don't want it. But just, I guess it's like taxes. We take it for granted. But, you know, we shouldn't take death for granted. Death is bad. In fact, death is so bad, death is so alien, that only, think about this, it was only the self-sacrifice of the Creator himself, as it says in John, only his self-sacrifice could do what needed to be done so we ultimately, death could be beat. Think about that. Death is so bad, so real, so powerful, it took the self-sacrifice of the Creator himself to suffer death and be resurrected as the only way we as humans can beat death, through God himself. Paul's so clear. Let's listen to this verse in Paul, 1 Corinthians 15. But if it's preached that Christ has been raised from the dead, how can some of you say that there is no resurrection of the dead? If there is, listen to this, if there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless and in vain. Woo! Look what he's saying. The credibility of the whole gospel rests on Christ having been risen from the grave. That's how important the promise and resurrection of the resurrection and mortality is. It's the only thing that keeps our lives in the long run from being ultimately, utterly meaningless. And so again, we can go back to Zoltan Istvan and his kooky immortality bust, like a coffin. It's weird, it's bizarre, but you know, I still think he has a point. He's just doomed to fail because the path he's on will never get him what he wants. Only the Lord can give us immortality. And you know, folks, he promises it to us too. And that's the good news of the gospel. That's such good news. But still, a 16-year-old killed in a plane crash, a 42-year-old man, prime of his life, everything going for him, dying of breast cancer. I mean, come on, please. It seems so unfair. So unfair. But you know, it is unfair. It seems so wrong, and it is wrong. And you know, suffering, evil, and death, sin, suffering, evil, and death are unfair, are wrong. I've been thinking about my 4 dead friends, even if it's the essence of senselessness, to try and make sense of what's senseless. It's like trying to define what by definition is undefinable. Look, I don't know the mysteries of life and death. All I know is that I'm alive, Harold, Erwin, Jimmy, and George are dead, and that in Christ I have the promise that the last enemy will be destroyed is death. I'll never reconcile with an enemy. I don't have to, but I accept it. I'll never accept it. All I know is one day it will be destroyed.